The community of St. Charles on the Fox River was an early settlement on the American frontier in northern Illinois in the 1830s. With great ambition, St. Charles incorporated as a city within a few years' time, in early 1839. As new arrivals poured into the city from the east, the young community was soon blessed, and cursed, by the arrival of the Franklin Medical College in 1842, one of the first medical education institutions in all of Illinois. Within a few years, the prestige bestowed by this new school was overtaken by the apprehensions of the local community and outlying areas, when hushed rumors of grave robbing passed from farm to farm and town to town. This is the tale of the St. Charles Resurrectionists, corpse stealers and body snatchers, a story culminating in a violent riot in the spring of 1849, centered upon the grave of an unfortunate young woman located miles to the west in Cortland, Illinois.
Primary sources for this video include the 1868 book, The History of DeKalb County, Illinois, by Henry Lansom Boys, the 1887 book, The Life and Adventures of Colonel L.A. Norton, by Lewis A. Norton, the 1908 book, The History of Kane County, Illinois, by Rodolphus Waite Jocelyn, period newspaper articles, period census records and vital records, period plat maps and U.S. Geological Survey maps, and period aerial photographs from the Illinois Archives and the Kane County Archives.
In the evening hours of late March 1849, along Old State Road, once the St. Charles to Sycamore Road, heading west, a few young men alit from their horse-drawn wagon and entered the public house of James Lovell. 50-year-old Lovell owned a substantial farm along the route, but also operated a hotel and tavern, the Ohio Grove Hotel, said to be a substantial brick building, as a way stop between Sycamore, 3 miles to the west, and St. Charles, 17 miles to the east, two promising towns on the northern Illinois frontier. Lovell had arrived in Illinois in the late 1830s from New York State, bringing with him his wife, Catherine Linderman, and 9 children. As was the practice then, many of the Lovell children worked on the farm, as well as worked at the family inn.
The Ohio Grove Hotel was perched on the northwest edge of the Ohio Grove, an extensive timberland enveloping much of the northeast quarter of Cortland Township, DeKalb County. The grove lay east of the Kishwaukee River, which meanders northwest, eventually draining into the Rock River.
On this particular occasion, one of the Lovell daughters, who served in the dining room and tavern, overheard the conversation of the travelers as they spoke over their meal, in what she interpreted to be discussions of grave robbing. She informed her father, who then had one of his children check out the contents of the traveler's wagon parked outside the hotel, where they found digging implements beneath a blanket. After the strangers went on their way, Lovell informed friends in Sycamore to the west and Cortland to the south that grave robbers were in the area, and to keep a careful watch of the graves of the recent dead.
The good folk of Cortland and Sycamore Township had reason to be uneasy. Several years prior, in 1842, one of the first medical schools in Illinois had been established, the Franklin Medical College, 15 to 20 miles to the east along the Fox River in St. Charles, under the leadership of Dr. George Richards, a renowned physician, said to be of forceful character. In the early days of U.S. medical instruction, students were largely on their own in finding cadavers and corpses upon which they could practice and learn. Many resorted to grave robbing, especially those of indigent people or people known to have had little family in the area. The inhabitants of St. Charles, although happy at the prestige brought by the new medical school, nonetheless grew increasingly wary for the graves of their loved ones being disturbed or robbed. Although none proven, there were persistent whispers of suspected corpse resurrections in and near St. Charles, so as to supply Richard's medical school. As local suspicions and rumors mounted, body snatching activity seemingly reached out to more outlying areas, away from the Fox River and St. Charles, in places such as Sycamore, Cortland, and Maple Park.
One of the Cortland Township families alerted by Lovell was that of the Churchills, David and Maria Parker Churchill, prominent local farmers from New York, who had recently lost a daughter, Marilla, due to cholera on March 26th, at only 16 years of age. Marilla was a newlywed, having married George Kenyon a little more than 4 months prior, in mid-November of 1848. She was interred in the Ohio Grove Cemetery, set within an isolated rural landscape in a prairie just to the west of the Ohio Grove timberland, midway and a few miles distant from both Sycamore and Cortland, likely by March 29th or 30th, within a few days of her death.
The Resurrectionists were believed to have been drawn out to the Cortland area, primarily interested in the corpse of a recently deceased German immigrant, buried at the Ohio Grove Cemetery, a young man with no family in the area, and buried at the expense of the local community. And they apparently saw the recent burial of the young Marilla Churchill Kenyon as yet another opportunity for theft, another body to be harvested.
One might think that a disturbed grave would be easily noticed, but this was not the case. Rather than digging up the entire grave, body snatchers would instead dig a 3-foot by 3-foot hole at the head of the fresh grave, cutting away a portion of the wooden coffin lid, then pulling the body out by a rope or chain strapped beneath the chin of the corpse. The removed lid would be replaced and the hole filled in, often leaving little trace of the desecration. Indeed, it's difficult to say how many human cadavers, interred in the first half of the 19th century, were thus stolen, as the theft often went undetected.
In spite of the observance and diligence by the Churchills and Kenyons, they were soon aroused by subtle changes to Marilla's gravesite. After exhuming her grave, they discovered in horror that her corpse was no longer within her coffin, within a week or two of her burial. Suspicions were immediately cast towards the recent travelers, believed to have been from the nearby medical school in St. Charles.
And so, without delay, on Wednesday, April 18, 1849, the bereaved husband, 21-year-old George Kenyon, and Marilla's 41-year-old father, David, along with another dozen family members and friends, traveled to St. Charles, a 3-hour journey at that time, to confront the directors of the Franklin Medical College for the return of Marilla Kenyon's corpse. As the college stood on the east side of the Fox River in St. Charles, Illinois, the Churchill-Kenyon contingent would have had to cross over the river via a precarious footbridge, with the spring runoff surging below, as the more substantial wooden bridge, which allowed wagons to pass over, had been washed away downriver in the surge of the spring thaw a few weeks previous.
Once across the river, it was but a short distance to the Franklin College, just a few hundred feet up the dirt road that led east. The traditional view of the location of the Franklin Medical School was at the northeast corner of Main Street, today Illinois Route 64, and Riverside Avenue, or 100 East Main Street. Another source suggests the school was a few doors down, at 108 East Main Street. In either case, it is remarkable that the original building housing the Franklin Medical School yet survives, the traditional location in particular having gone through multiple facelifts in the past 175 years.
Here the contingent found Dr. George W. Richards, said to be a formidable figure. Dr. Richards was a native of New York and had graduated from Fairfield Medical College in Herkimer County, New York, in 1828, marrying his wife Elizabeth at about this same time. Richards became a member of the Onondaga County, New York Medical Society in 1828, then vice president of the organization in 1835, then president in 1836. The Richards came to Illinois sometime in the late 1830s, first spending time in Lockport, in Will County, Illinois, before arriving in St. Charles in about 1841. Dr. Richards, along with several other St. Charles physicians, established the Franklin Medical College a year later, in 1842, occupying the second floor of the two-story brick building at Main and First Avenues, then one of the finest buildings in St. Charles, on the east side of the river, where Richard served as dean, as well as professor of anatomy and physiology.
Dr. Richards also taught at the LaPorte Medical College in Indiana and helped to establish the Rock Island Medical School in western Illinois in 1848, where he also taught medical practice. Apparently, this was necessary so as to properly graduate students of the St. Charles Franklin College with a medical degree, as Richard's institution lacked accreditation as a medical school from the Illinois State Legislature. In fact, it appears that foes of the Franklin Medical College had used their political influence to establish a competing shadow college in St. Charles in early 1843, the Literary and Medical College of the state of Illinois, with an official state charter and accreditation, although there is no evidence that this school ever actually existed. As the legislature rarely gave licenses to more than one school in a county, this appears to have been done so as to block accreditation for Richard's school.
And so his body of work indicates that Richards was indeed a prominent physician and medical educator of his time, widely respected, although with some noted detractors and enemies. He was said by contemporaries to have been a natural teacher, someone who could attract and hold the attention of young men. But descriptions also suggest a person somewhat imperious in character, arrogant and domineering.
Dr. George Richards and his wife, Elizabeth, had at least 3 children. Daughter Juliet, aged 21 years and married to Robert Thomas, a student of Dr. Richards. Daughter Mary Jane, then 19 years of age, and married to Orpheus Everts, another of Dr. Richards' students. And son, George W. Richards, Jr., then 16 years of age. It was widely believed at the time that it was George W. Richards, Jr., along with John Rood, one of Dr. Richards' medical students, and perhaps 1 or 2 more students, who were directly involved with the thefts of the bodies from Cortland Township, DeKalb County.
Once confronted by the Cortland contingent, reports suggest that Richard showed little empathy towards the angry group and denied knowing anything of the affair. However, upon their insistence, he did give them leave to search the Institute building and grounds, which consisted of the second story of the structure, as well as the outbuildings, including a barn. Nothing of relevance to Marilla Kenyon was found, although George Kenyon insisted that a lock of blonde hair found on the barn floor must have belonged to her.
Empty-handed, the frustrated troop returned sullenly home to DeKalb County, slowly building the case as they went that the Franklin Institute must have been forewarned of their arrival, and thereby hid the Marilla Kenyon body from discovery. They told their story to family members and neighbors upon their return, which fomented much anger and dissatisfaction within the communities of Cortland and Sycamore. The next morning, a larger group set out from DeKalb County for St. Charles, a literal wagon train along the St. Charles-Sycamore Road, said to consist of anywhere from 50 to 200 armed individuals, mostly men, who planned to use sheer numbers and force if necessary to retrieve the missing corpse of Marilla Kenyon.
As the armed band arrived in St. Charles about noon on Thursday, April 19th, they reconnoitered on the west bank of the Fox River at the Howard House Hotel, no doubt wetting their whistle after the 3-hour journey into the river town. As the Franklin Medical College and the home of Dr. Richards were located on the other side of the river, it was going to take some doing to get their entire band across the water. It was not exactly storming the citadel when most had to carefully walk in single file across the sketchy bridge, while a handful of wagons and their horse teams swam precariously against the Fox River current. Once across, somewhat damp and ornery, the company reassembled near Dr. Richards' house on the south side of Illinois Avenue, while a small contingent approached the house.
Dr. Richards was expecting them, likely having received word of their approach well in advance, if not personally observing their ponderous crossing of the river from the vantage point of his house high on the eastern riverbank. He met the DeKalb delegation on his doorstep, apparently armed, with his family members and several of his students taking shelter within the house, all the while listening closely to the conversation at the front door.
Tensions mounted quickly as Dr. Richards met their demands with callous denials, rebuttals, and threats. Heated words with raised voices were exchanged, and the mob gathered around the Richards house grew loud and clamorous. In the next moment, several gunshots were fired, originating from both the crowd and the house. Accounts vary as to the source of these first shots, depending on which version of the events you believe. But the outcome of this fiery exchange was that Dr. Richards was gravely wounded on his doorstep, a musket ball passing through his hand into his chest and shoulder. Another musket ball struck student John Rood, who was standing close to Richards in the doorway, passing deep into his torso. As Richards retreated into his house, a thrown rock broke through a window, lacerating his face. More rocks were reportedly thrown, breaking many of the windows of his beleaguered home. The unappeased DeKalb mob grew more unruly, shouting threats of razing the Richards frame building if he could not produce the body of Marilla Kenyon.
Although Dr. Richards did not have the best of reputations in the fledgling city, due to rumors of grave robbing, the riot had nonetheless reached a point at which the St. Charles sheriff, as well as leading members of the town, could no longer stand idly by, while a non-resident posse took over their streets, creating mayhem. They attempted to appease the unruly crowd, but it was difficult to be heard over the shouting and drama of the moment. In time, however, they managed to parlay a deal whereby a small group of the DeKalb contingent could thoroughly search the Richards house and outbuildings, as well as the Franklin Medical School, for any signs of the Kenyon corpse.
This seemed to satisfy the mob for the moment, and a thorough search and examination of the Richards house, barn, and the nearby school was soon conducted, while Richards and Rood were taken elsewhere for medical attention. In the search, which bordered on a ransack, furnishings within the house and equipment within the school were rifled and turned upside down, much of it being damaged in the pursuit. But ultimately, nothing was found by the frustrated search party.
By now, the time had slipped into the late afternoon and early evening. The crowd did not yet have the body of Mrs. Kenyon, but they accepted at least partial victory and vengeance for their loss, having dealt a serious blow to the body, household, and institution of Dr. Richards. Besides, they were likely getting hungry from a hearty day of mayhem and rioting on the streets of St. Charles.
In the days that followed, Dr. Richards was brought to Chicago for more expert medical attention, but the whereabouts of Marilla Kenyon's body was still unknown. Although much of the DeKalb County mob had by now returned to their homes, some remained behind in St. Charles to continue agitation for her return and threatening anyone that might have had a hand in hiding her remains. The aggrieved Dr. Richards, nursing his wounds in Chicago, sought restitution against the rioters, and so sought the counsel of attorney William D. Berry, who then had a law practice in St. Charles.
Berry saw at once that the first order of business to resolving this affair was to produce Marilla's body for the brooding Kenyon and Churchill families. As Dr. Richards and his colleagues continued to claim no knowledge of her whereabouts, Berry quietly sought out Richards' cowering students, as at least one or more of them were thought to be directly involved in the disappearance of the Kenyon corpse. And from these furtive conversations over the course of a few days, Berry learned of Marilla's whereabouts and worked out a secret plan to restore her body to her family.
In the closing days of April 1849, Berry walked into the office of his law clerk, a young man who was himself studying to be a lawyer under Berry's tutelage, 31-year-old Louis Adelbert Norton. In addition to being an eager student, Norton was already a veteran of 2 wars. the Canadian Rebellion in 1837, and the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, a rugged young man who had seen more than his share of death and injury. Barry asked whether Norton would be willing to perform a secretive mission that would restore the remains of Marilla Kenyon to her family, while doing so quietly, under the cover of darkness, so as not to draw attention, and to maintain the confidentiality of involved parties. Norton readily agreed, and Barry proceeded to inform him of the careful arrangements that he had worked out over the previous week, instructions that needed to be carried out in complete secrecy, and that very evening.
At 12 o'clock tonight, go to a certain point in town, and you will find a span of horses and a spring wagon with a shovel in the wagon. Take the horses and first drive to Geneva, a town 2 miles below on the Fox River. Go to Danforth's shop, where 2 men will bring you a coffin. You need not speak. Then drive to Cedar Bluff, where you will hitch the horses. On examination, you will see the white bones of a horse's head at the commencement of a path, and strewn along the path, you will find white bones until it leads you through the woods to the head of a ravine near Otto Perkins' fence. Thence, follow down the ravine about 3/4 of a mile, where you will find the tops of the bushes all broken in towards each other. There, dig.
Norton's first-hand account continues.
At midnight, I was at the point, found the horses hitched, untied them, drove to Geneva and to Danforth's shop. 2 men emerged from the shop, carrying a coffin. They placed it in the wagon without a word. I glanced at it and saw that the lid was screwed down when I remarked, "Bring a screwdriver." One of them soon returned and placed a screwdriver in the wagon. When, without another word, I drove back to Cedar Bluff, where I hitched the horses, and soon found the horse's skull marking the path, with other marks indicating my path through the woods. I followed it with the shovel on my back. I do not remember whether I whistled to keep up my courage or not, but as I am a poor whistler and a worse singer, I probably kept silent. I found the white bones marking the path, as Barry had told me, which I followed until I reached the head of a dark gulch, the one referred to in my instructions. Thence down through the tangled brush and underwood, until I came to the spot indicated, where the bushes were all broken in towards each other. There was no moon, but a starlight night. Owing to the thick woods and heavy foliage overhead, it was very dark. When I commenced digging, I found the bed of the gulch very wet and muddy. I had not prosecuted my labors very long, until my shovel struck something yielding. I cleaned the dirt away as well as I could, put my hand down, and got hold of a sack. I pulled it out, found that it contained the body, shut up like a jackknife, having the limbs from the hips bent forward so that the face and feet worked together. I took the body from the sack and found that the oozy mud had settled all over it. I wiped it off as best I could, shouldered it, and made my way back to Cedar Bluff. There was a small creek of pure water, and I washed the body clean. I found that they had cut through the skin and flesh on the forehead and skinned it down till it fell like a flap over the eyes. I placed it back as smoothly as I could, preparatory to putting it into the coffin. But here was a dilemma. No one had thought of a shroud, and I could not think of placing the body in the coffin in a nude state. While revolving the matter in my mind, I happened to think of my outer shirt. I at once pulled it off and put it on the corpse. I then gathered some moss, placed it in the coffin for a pillow, placed the body in the coffin, screwed down the lid, and drove the wagon back where I found it, according to directions. After hitching the horses where I found them, I pushed on toward home, but could not repress my curiosity to dodge around a corner and watch to see what would become of the wagon. I saw a man unhitch the horses and drive through Fox River at the ford, making his way west in the direction of the home of the distressed parents and friends of the deceased. 2 days elapsed when news came from DeKalb County that the missing body had been restored, that it was found in a coffin, sitting on the father's porch, and that there was great rejoicing.
Meanwhile, medical student John Rood lingered on in St. Charles, but died from his wounds within a month of the violent affray, passing away on Sunday, May 13th. The result of the April vigilante mob action now being vandalism, assault, and manslaughter. By the end of May 1849, more than a dozen members of the riotous mob were formally indicted by a Kane County grand jury. Perhaps in retaliation, a DeKalb grand jury then indicted Dr. Richards for grave robbing. None of these charges were ever pursued with any vigor and seemingly faded away with time as the local apprehension and anger abated.
Dr. Richards slowly recovered from his wounds, but was never quite the same thereafter, as his right hand had been paralyzed by the bullet that had torn through his hand and shoulder, requiring him to learn to write with his left hand. The Franklin Medical College was no more, and the remaining dozen or so students needed to finish their term of education at other nearby schools. Dr. Richards, after recovering, traveled to Rock Island, Illinois, where he continued teaching medicine with the fledgling Rock Island Medical School. A few years later, in July of 1852, in something of a family falling out, Dr. George W. Richards and Dr. Robert J. Thomas, Richards' former student and husband of daughter Juliet, formally dissolved their medical practice and partnership by mutual consent. Following his time at Rock Island, Richards had relocated to Dubuque, Iowa, practicing medicine and helping to found the Northwestern Medical Society, being elected the first president in the first few months of 1853. But this moment of distinction was short-lived, as Richards passed away as a result of pneumonia on April 22nd of 1853. Richards' body was subsequently interred in a cemetery within the lower town of Dubuque, along the Mississippi River. However, it is not without irony that in the years that followed, the cemetery holding his remains was washed away in a major flood event. His body, along with many others, swept downriver, never to be recovered.
Marilla's newlywed husband, George Kenyon, soon found love once more and remarried a little over 6 months after the St. Charles Riot. David Churchill, Marilla's father, tragically drowned at the age of 45 in the sinking of a boat launch in Nicaragua on his return from the California gold mines in March of 1854, weighed down by $299 in currency, a considerable sum, more than $37,000 in today's money. His wife, Maria Parker Churchill, on the other hand, continued on for decades, living into the 20th century, passing away in 1901. Young Marilla Kenyon, who went to journey after her death and unknowingly sparked a dangerous riot, was brought home to Cortland and finally laid to rest once again in the Ohio Grove Cemetery. The somewhat cryptic epitaph engraved upon her headstone was said to have been chosen by her bereaved husband. Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Marilla now rests for eternity, one would hope, alongside her mother and father in the Churchill family plot.
There are many unresolved questions related to this story. For example, what role, if any, did Dr. Richard's enemies play in fomenting the mob against him? And perhaps most importantly, did Dr. Richards have first-hand knowledge of the remains of Marilla Churchill Kenyon? Based upon our own research, we suspect that he did not. However, he and his colleagues were almost certainly aware that human bodies were being taken without permission from graveyards by their students, likely as they themselves had done during their own medical training. They simply chose to look the other way, perhaps arrogantly believing that they had the right to do so, and by so doing sealed their own fate when the ghoulish practice was ultimately discovered.
But the Resurrectionist Riot of 1849, reported in newspapers across the U.S., ultimately had a beneficial outcome, as it highlighted the need for medical students to have access to human cadavers in order to be properly trained in the treatment of the living. This event, along with others, drove legislation in the latter part of the 19th century that provided for the ethical use of unclaimed dead from charity hospitals to be turned over to anatomical societies, cadaver societies, and local medical colleges, whereby cadavers could be used for medical research and training, and the dead, for the most part, could rest in peace.
A big shout out to Eric Krupa of the St. Charles History Museum, and also to St. Charles historian Steve Gibson, who shared their deep knowledge, as well as their thrill of adventure in the making of this video. And as always, many thanks to our loyal Be Historic channel community, and to our Patreon subscribers. You have helped our channel to grow and to produce better videos, and we continue to be humbled by your unflagging support. As always, if you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and consider supporting our channel on Patreon. We hope to see you, in a matter of speaking, in our next video adventure.